Um, yeah, thank you all again for being here. It means a lot. I realized that I've done a couple different readings and performances and lecture performances since I graduated, but this is probably my most involved one in terms of planning and things like that so far. So I appreciate you all being here and being able to have an audience for it. Um, all recorded, Ralph? Cool. I want, I wish, I yearn, I crave, I refuse, I cannot and cannot but hope to take up the posture of the intellectual. And I want to take up the posture of the intellectual man, an image that I now do and do not project. To become a simulacral facsimile, a poor image of the intellectual man. I put it on as Robert Morris has put it on, this being one of his many nebulous selves, one of his many performances, a fractured fraction of what would otherwise be thought of as his unified self, of his many characters that comprise the self placed upon him by others who, Ariadne states, could just as easily be fools. It is this one she does not mention, but I believe it merits inclusion, if only because it is the most fool-like. She later on in the same lecture elucidates how we can think of Morris in general as a dandy, as a man who thinks himself an illusion, or as she quotes John Kelsey writing about the work of Michael Kreber in regard to the dandy, quote, "The dandy's decentering of his own identity is the means by which he makes the world around him start to lose its grip," end quote. This is all to say that this intellectual man I put on is really a foolish dandy in disguise. Something in the midst of the real and the virtual that sees these as not so disparate. Everything mirrored back on itself. I present to you an image, a series of mirages, as an act of theater. A series of minor gestures, as Aaron Manning would put it, towards a sort of practice interested in the labor of knowledge beyond the neurotypical. I can only begin again, as I always attempt, interested in questions without answers. This is no longer about defining a successful practice, but rather choreographing something akin to one that allows myself to live in the world even as it loses its grip. For here, I must speak with the I, speak for my selves, if I'm to follow in the disunity of Morris's selves, to follow him somewhere between, where a secret third thing does and does not live. As a first example to begin this choreography, here is Simone Forti, the postmodern dancer, writing about a time living with Morris when they were married. Quote, "I'd do things like placing a stool in the middle of the room and a roll of toilet paper over by the wall, and then sitting somewhere on the floor and from time to time moving something. Bob had stopped painting. He was actively trying to do nothing, but actually he was reading voraciously," end quote. I take now the voice of late art historian Maurice Berger. Quote, "The lecture had been announced weeks in advance. An art historian, conservatively attired in a gray suit, white shirt, and striped tie, steps to the podium. He adjusts his glasses, he drops his left hand, he feels his chin momentarily, and then he begins his lecture. The words come haltingly, echoed by a tape recording of the speech, which moves in and out of synchronization. When the speaker fills his water glass, the sound is heard moments later. The speech itself is curious and circular. It is a text taken directly from the writings of another art historian, Erwin Panofsky. Plagiarizing Panofsky's Studies in Iconology, the lecturer describes a single everyday gesture. Quote, "When an acquaintance greets me on the street by removing his hat, what I see from a formal point of view is nothing but a change of certain details within a configuration that forms part of the general pattern of color, lines, and volumes which constitute my world of vision. When I identify, as I automatically do, this as an event, hat removing, I have already overstepped the limits of purely formal perception and entered a first sphere of subject matter of meaning," end quote. Oddly enough, and this is still Berger, this lecture took place not at a museum or at some august art historical symposium, but at the small surplus theater in New York City in 1964. The lecturer was Robert Morris, then a little-known artist and performer, and the lecture itself was a performance piece entitled 21-3. Each movement, each facial inflection, Each gesture enacted by Morris was premeditated. Come in with glasses on, drop left hand, feel chin, look at ceiling. Bend over text are some of the hundreds of cues entered into the script. Ultimately, the clash of reduplicated voices and the intentional lapses in synchronization frustrate the spectator's ability to render meaning from the mannered gestures or from the now garbled text. In this strange theater, where even the most benign instance of spontaneity is unacceptable, content yields to the histrionic patterns of Morris's movements. Lost in these articulations and gestures, the issue at hand, Panofsky's search for the cultural codes that define the tipping of a hat, is soon forgotten. End quote. This is a theater of negation. A dance of a lecture, as Gordon Hall would say. A manifestation of an attempt to make self-conscious our processing of the cultural codes of meaning in the mannerisms of the speaker, focusing on the movement of the body as formal elements making meaning in a lecture performance dedicated to the mundane. It is concerned with communication, with the limits of outdated modes of accessing what it means to make work, do work, make meaning as a kind of work. Coming from a background of philosophy and participating in the early days of arts professionalization through the MFA program, Morris investigates the modes and methodologies of the art historian. Takes up the posture of an intellectual, which he could by all respects claim. And while Berger would argue he parried it, I follow in what Area Dean has said about Robert Morris, in that it is one of his many fractured selves that are a part of his refusal of the unified artist subject. It is a scathing parody of the art historian's practices presented within an incredibly tight choreography, and so it can be read through the frustrations it enacts as humorous. And Morris was not above the utilization of humor. But the idea that it is also, more interestingly for me right now, a simultaneous serious prodding into the scaffolding of knowledge and its manifestations. This is what I want to follow from. It's what my own practice is interested in, and it's what drew me to this work when I first encountered it through Hall's lecture performance, Read Me That Part Again, where I disinherit everybody 6 years ago. I take now the voice of artist, writer, and independent curator Lauren Fournier. Quote, in 1971, the American conceptual artist Adrienne Piper performed a private work in her studio apartment in New York City. In the piece, Piper fasted and read Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, periodically interrupting her reading to take photographic self-portraits. The artist's choice of philosophy text was significant. The Critique of Pure Reason is a canonical work of Enlightenment-era philosophy that occupied a central place in art world conversation at the time, largely thanks to the influential American art critic Clement Greenberg's preoccupation with Kantian aesthetics. As such, Kant's philosophy was at the core of Greenbergian formalism and modernist art theory in the mid-century art world within which Piper was working. As a recent art school graduate, Piper was told by her peers that she should read Kant, because his philosophical writings engaged with similar ontological and epistemological questions to those that Piper was engaging with in her studio work. She decided to start reading Kant, but rather than keeping this act separate from her studio practice, she framed it as a part of a conceptual artwork. The performance, which Piper would title Food for the Spirit, consisted of her moving between monastically reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, or rather his first critique, scribbling annotations in the margins as she read passages over and over, and capturing her image on a photographic film negative using a Kodak Brownie camera and a mirror. The photographs, which were developed after Piper completed the durational performance, serve as the primary documentation of the work, often displayed in galleries and museums as a stand-in for the original private performance. End quote. And here now is Adrienne Piper's statement on the work. Quote, private loft performance continuing through the summer. While reading and writing a paper on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, fasting, doing yoga, and isolating myself socially. Whenever I felt that I was losing my sense of self due to the profundity of Kant's thought, I went to the mirror to peer at myself to make sure I was still there, and repeat aloud the passage in the critique, underlined on the following pages, that was shaking the foundations of my self-identity, until it was just, in parentheses, psychologically manageable, words. I recorded these attempts to anchor myself by photographing myself and tape recording the reiterated passages. The tape has since been destroyed. These attempts did not succeed, so I eventually abandoned them and just studied the critique. Upon finishing the paper, I found I could not look at or think about the critique for 2 years afterwards, end quote. Piper's food as a performance not only challenged her own self-identity, but as Fournier argues for, simultaneously sets up a proto-auto-theoretical mode of working, where the philosophical is exposed to the I, the embodied self of the artist, and put at productive odds with it. In general, Fournier defines the auto-theoretical as a, quote, term that refers to the integration of theory and philosophy with autobiography, the body, and other so-called personal and explicitly subjective modes, end quote. In this work's case, it is an affirmation of the physical body one exists in, within, through its own denial in the practice, pushing the body physically and socially to extremes of deprivation, while simultaneously pushing it mentally to an extreme of intake. There is much Fournier gives us in her chapter on the work in her book, Auto Theory as Feminist Practice in Art Writing and Criticism, but I wish to focus primarily on Piper's use of the mirror and the imaging of the self. While this is an early work, we will see the ways in which it tracks when looked at within the context of her larger oeuvre, in which she has worked against the stable unity of identity generally and racial identity in particular. Or as Holland Cotter put it in the text for her MoMA retrospective, quote, her aim is not to assert racial identity, but to destabilize the very concept of it, end quote. Piper's work becomes a working through of an attempt to grapple with what Kant wrote in regard to the relation between appearances or representations and the, quote, thing in itself. That is, we cannot access the, quote, thing in itself a priori, but we can perceive it a posteriori. And it is these two forms of knowledge that come against each other in the self-portraits in the mirror. As Fournier outlines for us in the chapter much more adequately than I can in the time I have, it is, in particular, Piper's self-imaging through the mediation of the mirror that lets us think the simultaneous and complicated subjectivity and objectivity of the self through the doubling mechanism of the narcissistic selfie. That is, in photographing herself in the mirror at these moments where she is disappearing into the text that, quote, shakes the foundations of her self-identity, end quote, she makes a, quote, functional attempt to transmute that which is accessible to intuition into that which is accessible to understanding, end quote. The a priori into the a posteriori. The self-consciousness of apperception that Kant argues for, in which we can intuitively know ourselves as subjects through the representation of I think, even as we cannot know it any further, necessitates a complication of the self. In this attempt at objective validity through the photograph, which in its representation of her in the photographic print shows varying levels of visibility of Piper as both subject and, in parentheses, art object, Piper has acknowledged the failures of the attempt since. And yet this follows from the very aporias that came out of Kant's writing in the first place, and acknowledges the complications of self and identity that came in her later works on racial designation as something that is somehow supremely knowable. We cannot get to her as thing in itself through these photographs, but it is this frustration that enables a productive understanding of the failures of desires to grasp and hold some solid other as discrete object, and rethink our productions of the real and the seemingly knowable. The practice and its process becomes more important than the end knowledge and the form. We can turn to something Dean wrote/spoke about Morris's use of mirrors that feels useful here. Quote, such a mirror can disappear the subject as quickly as it can fix her, end quote. Or perhaps we turn to a work Fournier references earlier in the chapter by British Palestinian artist Mona Hatoum titled You Are Still Here, in which the title in all caps is sandblasted onto the center of a mirror. The resonances of reminding the viewer that we are still here asks us to consider how this narcissistic self-looking act of seeing ourselves in the mirror is ambivalently affirming, but just as much how we in this act also project ourselves out of our bodies to acknowledge those who are not still here. I will leave that here now for us to look into. I find in Fournier's examination of narcissism in her accounts of these works something crucial and telling, insofar as, following from her discussion of the charges of narcissism historically placed on women and racialized people as a way to dismiss the works they make because they become, quote unquote, overdetermined by their bodies, we can understand in her unpacking of it something productive. Referring to mid-20th century existentialist feminist views that women more readily see themselves as objects instead of subjects, and therefore the mirror as a doubling mechanism allows them to see themselves as both subject and object. Fournier point to what both Piper and Hatoum recognize as the, quote, ambivalently affirming effect and affects of enacting this literally narcissistic or self-looking turn to the mirror as evidence of their own existence, end quote. Crucially, I would go so far as to say that Hatoum's use of the pronoun you and Piper's direct looking into the camera embroil the other, the more than ourselves, in this doubling mechanism as well. We can turn to Fournier's point following the philosopher Lucé Irigaray writing on the mirror as something which distorts in the same way patriarchal views distort women's bodies. Quote, yet the mirror image is not an exact image of ourselves, but an inverted reflection, an inversion of our bodies as objects in space and time, end quote. Then we can think this mirroring, this distortion, this creation of two as something beyond the negative. Like in art, when you look at two works side by side, there's always another ephemeral and illusory artwork you create that exists in the middle. Or rather, the secret third thing that arises when juxtaposition and interrelation are allowed to happen. Even if we can't articulate a reasoning for their producing this third thing, except these two other things exist side by side for this moment. The productive gaps that manifest between oneself and the mirror. My brain turns to autistic mirroring, the action by which the autistic person mimics small gestures or feelings of the other person, to meet an energy, to recognize another in space. The mirror is always already there. I take now the voice of cultural theorist, political philosopher, and artist Aaron Manning. Quote, the artful, in my reading of it, is aligned to what I have elsewhere called autistic perception. Autistic perception is the opening in perception to the uncategorized, to the unclassified. This opening, which is how many autistics describe their experience of the world, makes it initially difficult to parse the field of experience. Rather than seeing the parts abstracted from the whole, autistic perception is alive with tendings that create ecologies before they coalesce into form. There is here as yet no hierarchical differentiation, for instance, between color, sound, light, between human and non-human, between what connects to the body and what connects to the world. When we engage in practice, when we are subsumed by process, we often seek this kind of perception, and it is available to us all. Autistic perception does not belong exclusively to autistics. The difference is that, except in extreme circumstances, most of us parse experience before having a direct experience of the field and its complexity. The autistic, on the other hand, directly perceives the complexity before and between the parsings, end quote. A priori versus a posteriori knowledge. This becomes a kind of thing theory, the thing being a kind of secret third thing. It's no coincidence, then, that Annette Michelson, writing about Duchamp's use of the quote-unquote autistic economy in his work, would be utilized by Berger to discuss the autistic tendencies of Morris's work. Having discussed the problematics of shifters, words that assign personal identity, often pronouns, which constantly change depending on context, think the you of Hatoum. In regard to children's difficulty grasping them, how they are often the first to go in cases of aphasia, or how the problem of an individuated self is a core problem in autistic children, and how these shifters collapse in Duchamp and Morris's work. This tie is Duchamp brand. Not that Duchamp. Berger writes, quote, but like Duchamp's linguistic imperative, the strategy of reduplication inherent in Morris's pharmacy, as well as his later mirror pieces, resembles the running around in circles of the autistic child who never finds his elusive center, who is unable to connect with the linguistic order that would facilitate the search, end quote. Found in Berger's book Labyrinths, the conversation doesn't end here. Later in the book, he brings up the importance of, quote, autistic or psychotic states as recuperative experiences, end quote, as being crucial to the New Left's politics of the 60s and 70s, in order to disavow normalcy as a standard, and references in particular the work of Artie Lang, the British psychiatrist and a leading member of the anti-psychiatry movement. This notion of autism in relation to Morris's work was at least important enough to Berger that, quote unquote, autism has a place in the index at the back of the book. This begins to get us closer to the beyond of the neurotypical I'm finding in the works discussed herein. To double, to mirror, to repeat, to disunify into something which makes more of space than it otherwise would be. The narcissistic examination of oneself in the mirror overlapped by the autistic mirroring of another person. What kind of perception does this allow us beyond the real, the virtual, the typical? Alongside this, as we consider what a choreography of a practice might look like, we can ask then, what does the disunity of an individual self allow? In the introduction to his now out-of-print book, Continuous Project Altered Daily, Morris writes, quote, I never set out to prove or demonstrate so much as to investigate, and I never set out to affirm so much as to negate, finding the former flowed from the latter in any case. Change and not continuity has been the guide. Heraclitus, not Anaximander, lit the path. Paradox and the fugitive were always more attractive than assured style and stable position. Rupture and disruption, not any organic development, provided the dynamic. If there was a constant, perhaps it was that rotting sack of humanism that has always provided a target. Within that sack, and one of the first things I set out to shatter for myself, was the unity of a subject, both with self and with a monolithic, coherent style prescribed to flow from this ideological oppression, end quote. To shatter the unity of a subject in ourselves is to challenge stable, objective perception. Perhaps we can think it in productive contradiction to autistic perception. Either way, it allows us to think of Dean's mandate she brings in at the beginning of America's Bob Morris, her lecture, to be she who perceives, to recognize oneself in the act, to allow the examination of desire, of perception as an active process and not a passive factual absorption of the real. Much like Panofsky argued that in perceiving, we always already enter a first sphere of meaning, that which is form and that which is content is immediately inextricably entwined in a dance back and forth. Lecture performance then as a practice begins to be that which allows one to perceive and to present that perceiving as a work of art. It is a project concerned with meaning making so present within histories of art that's never as stable as we'd like to think it is when looking at those established histories. For when we say meaning, we must clarify what it is we mean by that, and what sorts of meanings gathered from what forms of knowing we allow as legitimate in the act of perceiving. This is where my love for the form of lecture performance comes from, and why when I come to the form, I always devolve into self-referentiality. And allowing myself to always in the body of the text question the text lets me lay bare these formal conventions and notions that put forward the other ideas I want to present therein. Form and idea are always already intertwined. It makes sense then that Morris becomes this touchstone for me in 21.3. Morris is no stranger to mirrors or to the act of mirroring. Let's get then at that quote-unquote rotting sack of humanism he wishes to push against in his decentering of the unity of subject. This decentering which occurs in the mirror of Piper, if only because it always doubles. It always pushes against the desires to be an individual above all individuals. Something in the way of Maurice Merleau-Ponty describing one of our hands touching the other to be both the perceived object and the subject perceiving, some secret third thing in the middle. I take now the voice of art historian Annette Mikkelsen. Quote, to describe, to account for that which they presented to view, is to relate the terms of a contradiction. Each object was dissolved even as it was defined, through reflection. Somewhere in the oscillation between the terms of the contradiction, during the reflective movement of its apprehension, within the space of equivocation, a fact was posited, a form was located. Real cubes were described by the virtual, inaccessible, intangible space of their mirrored surfaces. Those surfaces, in describing forms, posited facts as problematic, elicited reflection. The physical space of a perception was perceived as the mental space of paradox. a location issuing in speculation, end quote. She's writing about Morris's untitled mirrored cubes, but perhaps we can take what Mikkelsen says further if we think alongside it now. Humanism became problematic precisely because it required a definition of human to demarcate what it prioritized against the divine or supernatural. It found in facts and the real something which could be relied on autonomously, thinking always of oneself instead of the social and relational realities of the world. Perhaps one of Morris's most biting critiques of the rotting sack came in his video performance, The Birthday Boy, in which two videos played side by side of two different art historians discussing Michelangelo's David on the 500th anniversary of its creation. A work which epitomized for Morris a white male humanism which evoked war and dispassionate rationalism. In the two videos, almost the exact same talk is given, one by a male art historian, one by a female art historian, as its stage directions state. Each art historian slowly drinking more and more wine as they speak, spiraling into deep condemnations of the whole of humanist art history. There's a tired exasperation that permeates the whole of this, the two videos talking over and garbling each other in their differences. The work repurposes certain criticisms and techniques of the early 21-3 performed 40 years prior. This work repurposes... No, I read that already. It is odd and frustrating and goes against any kind of celebration of the humanism that David represented. It is mediated and theatrical and plays up the drama and reintroduces narrative to art that both art historians argue had been eliminated in art beginning with David. We squirm. It is a theater of negation which the practice of 500 years or question is really being what we ever wanted to end up working with, even as we have. At certain points, it feels like a condemnation of what art has become, decrying it for the good old days. Humor and mistakes and drunkenness undercut any possibility to take the conclusions fully seriously. The seriousness and professionalism and skills that we thought would save us when the time came got lost in the complicated vicissitudes of life that is lived day by day in anxious anticipation of whether the resources necessary to continue will be there tomorrow. This is even to assume that they were ever there to begin with. So many artists have money or energy or patrons or time in massive abundance when none of us could even imagine this, that the social skills necessary to continue the conversation were not just expertly mirrored from the beginning. Every choice made that was considered to be right in actuality was what drove us further and further away from the life we wanted to live, the life we were promised in the glowing days of adolescent possibility. When we could look up at David and think about how impressive it was that he was so well sculpted and big. When we could look in the mirror and recognize what we were and not just think of what could have been in that mirror. Where the mirror didn't always reflect all of the outside world back at us constantly and consistently. But wait, is this now not allowing us to fall into the same conclusions of horror that Morris comes to? Or rather, that a simple view of his work would cause us to fall into? This lecture performance began like Morris's, as a celebration of a milestone. I'm 30 now. And yet, the anxieties creep back in. So what is it I am to do about it? The nice thing about a choreography is that it sets a path for movement forward, one that is beautiful and inspiring and only ever realized in its fullest capacity by its undertaking. Morris's cynicism is not a condemnation of naivete, a return to the anxieties that come in critique so as to seem smart and capable. It's a parody. He is, as we must remember, the foolish dandy, looking in a mirror, asking us to push back against some unity that would solidify us in place, turn us into a one-trick statue. He sets us on our course to make the world lose its grip. And let's not forget Piper, the artist who, along with her other works, famously retired from being Black. Her work, which saw some definitive understanding of race in particular and identity in general, is a dangerous one. I will refrain from using the word mustn't, but that's what's nice about doing a lecture performance. Even my own words are questioned here, by you. But I'm not sure what other word to use right now, so pretend it's something else. We mustn't allow ourselves to be stuck in cynical anxieties which preclude the possibility of living a life, from enacting a practice, which each day brings us out into the world in a way that we may not have been able to do the day before. But there's a spiral happening here. I believe I've done this before. Trying to think what I need and want to say and how I wish to track a new choreography, attempting to find some secret third thing, or maybe I've found it already and it's better to say I'm always already trying again to attempt to live in it or with it. It's this movement through times, through artists, through now and then, a kind of spiral like the Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico might put it. Time is a spiral which repeats traumas and events in order for us to work through. a practice in movement. The going over again the territory to understand it, because the map can only be useful if it's simplified and lets us exist in the process, in the event. I wonder if it could have ever been another way. This is, as I've said after all, a lecture performance, and I'm still defining for myself what that might mean. How does a lecture become a performance anyway? Wasn't it always already, as Morris has been teaching us? Is it to look in the mirror occasionally and reminding us we're here amidst the theory, as Piper teaches us? Is it a refusal to let the practice coalesce into something too static? A use of something traditionally performative, dancerly, theatrical? Does the writing need to be lyrical? Is it the act of naming? Is it impossible to say? Is it a questioning of knowledge? My knowledge, your knowledge, their knowledge? Shifting, shifting, shifting. I prefer to think of it as a mode of working that allows for an introduction of language and image into a performance that masquerades as a lecture, putting something else on to try and glide through, hinting in small moments that perhaps the thing that you are viewing isn't as typical as it seemed at first appearance or glance. A kind of choreography of a practice, if I haven't said it enough already. To become the secret third thing, not just live with or in it. To recognize something powerful and moving along the desire path. Thank you. Also, don't worry, this is non-alcoholic wine.